The rise of the Imperium of Man begins with the fall of the Aeldari. From the 25th till the 30th millennium. Before the fall of their potent interstellar empire, the Aeldari were a technologically and psychically advanced humanoid species, generally considered the most powerful intelligent race in the entire galaxy. Their technology had advanced so far that little or no labor was required by individuals to provide the daily necessities of life. As a result of the sheer boredom and ennui that resulted, at some point during the 25th millennium AD, by the Terran calendar, groups of Aeldari began forming what were known as pleasure cults, dedicated to the pursuit of every pleasure and sensation that life had to offer their kind. Despite the prediction of their reclusive seers that warned of impending doom if the Aeldari did not change their hedonistic ways, government with the Empire soon collapsed, and the moral degeneration of their homeworlds and various colony worlds continued unimpeded. As the pursuit of ever more extreme experiences reached its height, death reigned in the streets of their cities, hunter and hunted, each being part of a twisted ritual of destruction that consumed millions in orgies of savage bloodlust and excess. Some were able to see that their now corrupt society was destroying itself, and fled in disgust. These refugees would settle in the distant, rural colonies of their empire, and would later be known as the Exodites, or take to the massive, world-sized Aeldari craft worlds and sail amidst the stars as merchants and explorers, far from the scenes of hedonistic excess that were destroying the heart of their empire in the galactic northwest. Upon death, the souls of all deceased, sentient beings traverse the bounds of the physical realm and go to rest within the hyperdimensional realm of psychically reactive energy that undergirds all of reality, known as the Imperium, or warp. As more and more corrupt Aeldari died, their souls began to coalesce into a larger entity within the warp, a living representation of the hedonistic corruption that had defined their lives. This growing presence in the warp caused massive warp storms to aggregate across the galaxy, eventually making interstellar travel and communications impossible for the colonies of humanity, bringing on mankind's age of strife. This gestalt collection of corrupt Aeldari souls gained sentience sometime in the late 30th millennium, creating the powerful new warp entity known as the Chaos God Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, called She Who Thirsts by the Aeldari. When she came to be, an ethereal explosion occurred that spanned the extent of warp space within the Milky Way galaxy, with the epicenter being located within the Aeldari core homeworlds. All caught in the immense psychic blast were instantly killed, their souls consumed by Slaanesh, and the surrounding region of space was transformed into a massive, permanent warp rift, later known as the Eye of Terror to humanity. the core Aeldari homeworlds were transformed into the ruined hellscapes today known as the Crone Worlds. Most of the remaining Aeldari gods, who themselves existed as entities within the warp, were destroyed by Slaanesh after its cataclysmic birth. Kaela Menshar Kane, the Aeldari god of war, attempted to combat the new Chaos God, but Kane's form was shattered and exiled to the mortal realm, where it came to rest in the infinity circuits of the Asuryani craft worlds, but could be embodied in the form of animated constructs called avatars, which rested in the hearts of the various craft worlds during times of grave peril. The only other gods to survive the fall were the trickster god Kegorach, also called the Laughing God, who hid himself within the webway, and Isha, who was ripped from the jaws of Slaanesh by the Chaos God Nurgle, who now keeps her as a slave within its hideous garden home within the realm of chaos. The fall utterly destroyed the once vast interstellar Aeldari Empire, leaving scattered bands of Aeldari fighting for survival. Before the fall, vast spacecraft called craft worlds were constructed, enabling those wishing to escape the degeneration of their homeworlds to flee, along with samples of their lost world's flora and fauna. When the fall occurred, the various craft worlds rode out the ethereal shock wave in the warp, some being destroyed in the process. The Exodite worlds, far from the epicenter of the terrible catastrophe, were largely untouched by the birth scream of Slaanesh. In order to prevent the events of the fall from ever recurring, the Aeldari of the craft worlds, who now called themselves the Asuryani, but were long known as the Eldar to outsiders, devised the Asuryani path system, by which every craft world Aeldari would follow a strict, almost fanatical life path pursuing a specific activity, such as crafting or war, for a portion of their long lifespans, before switching to another path when the previous one grew stale. In this way, the Asuryani hoped to control the extreme emotional and psychic sensitivity that had left them open to corruption by chaos in the first place. However, some corrupted Aeldari did survive the birth of Slaanesh by taking refuge within the webway itself, which had long been home to a nearly infinite cavalcade of hyperdimensional sub-realms that were protected from Slaanesh's predations by the psychic wards erected within the labyrinth dimension to keep the dangers of the warp at bay. These sadistic beings became known as the Drukhari, or Dark Eldar to outsiders, the inhabitants of the vast, dark city within the webway called Komorach. The Drukhari later preyed on humans and Asuryani alike to find souls whose torment and anguish they could physically devour to keep their own tainted souls from being consumed by Slaanesh. The Great Crusade. From circa 798.M30 till 005.M31. The Great Crusade of the Emperor of Mankind began as the Age of Strife came to an end for humanity. The warp storms isolating the human colony worlds for 5,000 Terran years had finally disappeared with the birth of Slanesh and the fall of the Aeldari in the 30th millennium. The man known only as the Emperor of Mankind, a perpetual and the greatest psyker in human history, had emerged mysteriously from the darkness of old night as the greatest warlord of the human homeworld. The Emperor, with the aid of his friend and ally Malkador the Sigillite, had united Terra under his rule during the Unification Wars in the final decades of the Age of Strife. He intended to use his genetically enhanced Space Marines and the Imperial Army to now reunite all of humanity under his enlightened rule and the rationalist philosophy of the Imperial Truth. Making a pact known as the Treaty of Mars with the cult mechanicus of the machine god on Mars in the late 30th millennium, the Emperor promised to allow the tech priests to continue to practice their faith and maintain the political autonomy of their mechanicum government if they provided him with the starships and other advanced technology he needed to reunite the human-settled galaxy. The Emperor was a man of enormous skill in the practice of science and the development of new technology, and so in him many members of the ancient Mechanicum saw the coming of the Omnissiah that had been prophesied by their faith. In the treaty they signed with him, the Mechanicum of Mars pledged their support to the creation of a new Imperium of Man, in which they would serve as the Imperium's primary purveyors of science and technology in return for first access to any ancient technology or archaeotech discovered beyond the bounds of the Sol system. With the signing of the Treaty of Mars, the symbol of the Imperium changed from the raptor's head and lightning bolt icon used by the Emperor during the Unification Wars on Terra to the double-headed eagle known as the Aquila, to symbolize the union of the empires of Earth and Mars. With the forge factories and industrial output of Mars, the Emperor was able to refit his armies, and more importantly, he now had the use of the Mechanicum's Titan Legions and Knights, giant robotic war machines with the potential to dominate the battlefield. At first, the newborn Imperium's expansion into interstellar space was slow, since the Imperial Army was still small, and more importantly, the Emperor's 20 Space Marine legions were inhibited by the absence of their Primarchs, the genetically engineered transhuman military commanders the Emperor had created during the Unification Wars to lead his eventual reconquest of the galaxy at the head of the Legionis Astartes. This lack made the time for the creation of a new Space Marine from a normal adolescent human male much longer. However, this difficulty was to end as, on Chthoniya, a planet in a star system not far from Terra, the Emperor for the first time was reunited with one of his missing Primarchs, Horus. Having been discovered at an early age, he took him under his wing and taught him all he knew. Horus and the Emperor had a truly unique bond, that of father and son, and many times they saved each other's lives. But after 30 standard years, he discovered another of the Space Marine Primarchs, Leman Russ, on the icy world of Fenris. Although Horus was pleased at the discovery of one of his brothers, he secretly hoped to always remain his father's favorite son. In time, all the Primarchs were found on the worlds they had been sent to by the machinations of the ruinous powers of chaos, and each was placed in command of their respective Space Marine legions. The legions, as a result, were massively expanded with new recruits from their Primarchs' adopted homeworlds, and new Space Marines could now be produced within only a single Terran year. But this acceleration and the gene-craft techniques employed to bring it about produced fundamental defects within the psyche of each Space Marine, created from certain Primarchs' genetic heritages through this process. These defects were later to prove fatal to many of the Emperor's dreams for humanity. The Great Crusade lasted for 200 standard years, into the early years of the 31st millennium, and brought many long-lost star systems into the fold of the newborn Imperium of Man. Under the command of the War Council of the Emperor and his rediscovered Primarchs, vast expeditionary fleets comprised of the Imperial Army and the 20 Space Marine legions fought back aliens, feral human tribes, petty human dictators, and the warp-tainted forces that had gained control of large portions of human-settled space during the Age of Strife. Once a human-settled world had been pacified, it was brought into imperial compliance by a new imperial planetary governor chosen by the Emperor. Part of this process included the rooting out of any superstitious or religious beliefs of the population with a respect solely for reason and the measured advancement of science and technology, an atheistic belief system known as the Imperial Truth. The world was then often occupied by a unit or units of the Imperial Army that were left behind to complete the integration of the planet into the Imperium, while the expeditionary fleet, led by Astartes, moved on to its next target. As the Primarchs took control of the Space Marine legions that had been crafted from their gene seed, the Great Crusade separated, moving in many directions and reaching far across the galaxy. After the Imperial Crusade on the world of Ullanor concluded in O.M30, upon bringing that planet into Imperial compliance, the Emperor claimed it as the greatest victory of the Imperium to date, and that Horus should be given all the credit. Hailing Horus and his Lunar Wolves Legion, later renamed the Sons of Horus, the Emperor stated that he would have to leave the expeditionary fleets behind and return to Terra to begin the next secret phase of his plan to ensure humanity's domination of the galaxy. In his place, he announced that Horus would be declared War Master of the Imperium, the de facto commander of all the Emperor's armies on the Great Crusade. Although Horus was troubled that his father should leave him and his brother Primarchs to carry on alone for some unknown reason, with him as their new commander, the Imperium's armies and Space Marines continued to expand ever outwards, rediscovering lost human worlds and bringing them into the enlightened Imperium's fold. This expansion lasted for 5 more standard years, until the outbreak of the terrible Imperial Civil War known as the Horus Heresy. The Horus Heresy. From 5 till 14 M31. The seeds of destruction for the Emperor's great dream had already been planted. One of the Primarchs, Lorgar Aurelian of the Word-Bearers Legion, had secretly turned to the service of the Dark Gods of the Warp, approximately 160 standard years into the Great Crusade. Seeking the true source of divinity in the universe after the Emperor had brutally reprimanded Lorgar and his legion at the perfect city of Monarchia on the world of Kur for spreading the falsehood that the Emperor was the one true god of humanity, the Primarch began a great pilgrimage across the galaxy. Lorgar's quest eventually led the Word-Bearers into the heart of the great permanent warp rift in the Segmentum Obscurus, later named the Eye of Terror. There, Lorgar made contact with entities who he truly believed were divinities worthy of his worship, the Chaos Gods. Devoting himself to their vision of seeing the warp and real space intertwined into a single reality and the benefits he believed this would bring to humanity. The Primarch spent the next 4 solar decades preparing to convert his brothers and their legions to the service of chaos. To this end, Lorgar arranged for the War Master Horus to visit the barbarous world of Davin, not long after the end of the Ullanor Crusade. There, he arranged for the War Master to be mortally wounded by a weapon tainted by the dark touch of the Chaos God Nurgle, the Plague Father. Even a Primarch's superhuman constitution proved incapable of defeating the warp-tainted pathogen created by the Plague God, and so, to save his life, Horus's own Astartes handed him over to a cabal of Davinite chaos cultists known as the Temple of the Serpent Lodge. There, in a foul, sorcerous ritual that had been prepared by Lorgar and was overseen by the Word-Bearer's first chaplain, Erebus, Horus's spirit was cast into the warp, where the Chaos Gods promised to save his life if he would choose to become their servant and overthrow the rule of the Emperor of mankind. Manipulating his insecurities concerning his father's affection for him and his unquenchable desire for recognition, power, and glory, the Ruiner's powers succeeded in turning him against the master of mankind through a combination of lies and half-truths. With his agreement to their bargain, Horus's soul was returned to his body in the Davinite temple, and he awoke fully healed, though he now walked the path of damnation. Over the next few standard years, he began to surreptitiously move all the pieces of the Imperial military into place to launch a grand rebellion against the Emperor's authority that was intended to result in his claiming the throne world of Terra and the mantle of humanity's new Emperor. The War Master, always with the aid of Lorgar and his demonic allies, managed to suborn the loyalties of 8 of his brother Primarchs. He did this by exploiting their own insecurities concerning the Emperor's treatment of them and the jealous rivalries that many of the Primarchs had developed over the course of the Great Crusade with their fellows. Horus's promises of greater political autonomy and the removal of restrictions on the acquisition of certain technologies forbidden by the Emperor also won the allegiance of Kelbor-Hal, the fabricator general of Mars and leader of the ancient Mechanicum. By 5M31, the treason of Horus, known in later centuries as the Horus Heresy, spread to embrace approximately half of the Imperium's military forces, including small planetary defense forces, many regiments of the Imperial Army, the 9 Chaos Space Marine Traitor Legions, and nearly half of the ancient Mechanicum's potent Tagmata forces, Titan Legions, and Night Houses, forming the core of Mechanicum adepts who chose to serve the ruinous powers and were later called the Dark Mechanicum. The Horus Heresy truly began at the world of Istvan III, where Horus used the outbreak of a chaos-fueled rebellion against Imperial rule as a pretext to send all of the loyalist Astartes, those Space Marines who Horus and his allied Primarchs knew would never turn against the Emperor, to the surface. Once the loyalists of 4 of the Space Marine legions allied to him were planet-side and engaged in combat, the orbiting Imperial fleet unleashed a devastating bombardment of virus bombs upon them, seeking to kill all of the loyalists as well as the entire planetary population in what is remembered as the Istvan III atrocity. But he miscalculated, for several of the loyalists learned of the plot and were able to warn their battle brothers on the surface before the deadly barrage began. Thousands of loyalist Astartes survived, forcing Horus and the traitors to launch a weeks-long campaign of grinding urban combat against their former allies. At the same time, another group of loyalists aboard the Death Guard Legion frigate Eisenstein managed to flee into the warp with news of the War Master's betrayal, intending to let the Emperor know of the treachery of his favorite son. After Horus finished off the loyalists on Istvan III with an orbital bombardment once the skies over the target area had cleared enough to allow a precise orbital assault, he moved his forces to the neighboring world of Istvan V to await the Imperial retribution he knew would come. The Loyalists rightly believed they outnumbered Horus's 4 Space Marine legions, and so when the Emperor sent a force of 7 legions against him at Istvan V, they thought the War Master's rebellion would prove short-lived. But they had deeply underestimated the man the Emperor had chosen to take his place at the head of the Imperium's military machine. Of the 7 Legiones Astartes sent against him at Istvan V in circa 6M31, Horus had already secretly gained the allegiance of 4, who abruptly turned on the 3 loyalist legions and destroyed them almost to an Astartes. In a single stroke, at the so-called drop site massacre of Istvan V, he had nearly doubled his forces and weakened those of the loyalists to the point that he could now begin a drive on Terra itself. The terrible civil war that ensued as he drove towards the heart of the Imperium lasted for a further 7 stunted years, killed trillions of men and women across the galaxy, and culminated in 14M31 in a massive assault upon the Imperial Palace during the climactic Siege of Terra. After 55 solar days of fighting, the war was ended by the Emperor of Mankind and Horus dueling in single combat aboard his flagship, the Gloriana-class battleship Vengeful Spirit, in orbit of Terra, before further loyalist reinforcements could reach the world and throw the traitor forces back from their prize. Although mortally wounded during the final battle with his once favored son, who had become immensely powerful and swollen with the energies of the warp as a result of the united favor of the Chaos Gods, the Emperor was able to strike down Horus using the full, gathered might of his awesome psychic powers. Despite his great sorrow and reluctance, he obliterated his son's soul from the warp, preventing him from being resurrected to serve the ruinous powers once more. Without their leader, the unity of the forces of chaos soon crumbled, and as loyalist reinforcements led by Robert Guillermin of the Ultramarines arrived in the Sol system, the traitor legions of the Dark Mechanicum and mortal allies retreated to the massive warp rift in the Segmentum Obscurus known as the Eye of Terror. At his own direction, the crippled body of the Emperor was installed into the cybernetic life support mechanisms of the psychic amplifier known as the Golden Throne. This allowed his mind to have an anchor in real space from which he could battle the influence of the Chaos Gods in the warp and continue to direct the Astronomicon that was the lifeblood of the Imperium's communications, commerce, and interstellar travel. In a postscript to the terrible traumas of the Heresy, a battle between loyalists and traitors fought on the planet of Sothar, home to the ancient Necron warp beacon known as the Pharos, drew the attentions of the hive fleets of the Tyranids to the galaxy. It was in this ancient time that their vast biomechanical fleets first began to move across the extragalactic void towards the Milky Way galaxy, drawn ever on by the shining psychic beacon of the Astronomicon. The Great Scouring. From about 14 to some unknown date in M31. The Great Scouring, or simply the Scouring, was the Imperium of Man's great counter-offensive against the traitor legions. It began immediately after the end of the Horus Heresy, following the death of the War Master Horus and the failure of his assault upon the Imperial Palace during the Siege of Terra in 14M31. It eventually succeeded in driving the forces of chaos from their conquered territories within Imperial space into finding a refuge in the permanent warp storm known as the Eye of Terror. Before actually being confined for all time within the life support mechanisms of the Golden Throne, the Emperor had pronounced judgment on the traitors. He declared them excommunicat traitoris, and determined that they were to be driven into the hellish Eye of Terror, which would hold them for all eternity. All records and memory of the traitor legions were to be later expunged from the Imperial archives. Worlds such as Eastvan 5 and the former Legion homeworlds of the traitor legions would be scoured clean of all life because of the corruption of their people by chaos. These legions associated troops from the Dark Mechanicum, the Titan Legions, Chaos Knight Houses, or the regiments and starships of the Imperial Army and Imperial Navy that had turned to chaos were to be destroyed or driven into the eye. It would be as if they had never existed to sully the Imperium with their betrayal. After the death of Horus, those traitors who had not been slain outright during the Siege of Terra fled before the vengeful wrath of the loyalist forces led by the Primarch Robert Guilliman of the Ultramarines Legion, who also took on the burdens of leadership of the Imperium as the Imperial Regent and Lord Commander of the Imperium. Many traitors made good their escape into unexplored space or disappeared into the Eye of Terror or other less known warp rifts such as the Maelstrom. Fighting continued for many standard years after the heresy had ended with Horus's death, before the traitor forces were wholly destroyed or exiled into the Eye. Many chaos-corrupted star systems were cleansed and placed under the watch of the newborn Inquisition. The Emperor's dream of a new age of enlightenment, a time when mankind was freed from superstition and ignorance, would turn into something far different. The Great Scouring would be followed by the 10 millennia-long era known as the Age of the Imperium. But before that, the second founding occurred in circa 21 M31. In the midst of the campaigns of the Great Scouring, the second founding occurred. The remaining 9 loyalist Space Marine legions were disbanded, their warriors transferred into the far smaller 1,000 Astartes organizations known as chapters, in accordance with the newly established dictates of the Primarch Robert Guilliman's Codex Astartes. The Codex provided a highly detailed manual and instruction guide for the raising, training, organization, and military tactics of a Space Marine chapter. The purpose of this reorganization was to prevent any one leader like Horus from ever again making use of the power of an entire Space Marine legion against the Emperor's realm. At the same time, because of their smaller size, the Space Marines were transformed from the Imperium's primary frontline military forces into a dedicated planetary assault and rapid reaction force. A portion of the Space Marines, now collectively known as the Adeptus Astartes, maintained their parent legion's original names, badges and colors, whilst the remaining chapters took on new names and heraldry. The majority of these second founding chapters still serve the Imperium today.